The idea that all living things are made up of cells may seem quite obvious to us these days, but it wasn't the case a few hundred years ago, especially before the invention of microscope. So in the early 1600s, people started making microscope using magnifying glass, and Robert Hooke is one of them. He is an English scientist as well as an architect and a polymath. So he has a background in science and he loved observing the natural world. So what he does is that he made his own telescope and then he looked at many different things through his microscope and then put them down in drawing. He made a collection and then he published his drawing through a book called Micrographia right here. And it was published in 1665. Now, out of all the drawings that he did, believe me, this is his real drawing. He's quite a good artist. This one right here, this drawing right here is the most famous one in biology. So this is the microscope that he used, and this is an oil lamp. When it's lit, it's going to emit light, and then this structure focuses the light on the specimen that is here, and Robert Hooke would look through the eyepiece, through the lenses, and be able to see the magnified specimen. Now, out of all the things that he observed, cork was one of them, and it is the one that led him to the idea of cells. When he was looking at the cork, what he saw was little compartment-like structures, as drawn here. And this reminded him of the cells that monks used to live in. And so he called these structures cells. And that is the first ever published idea of cells. And we used the name that he's given to them. However, what Robert Hooke looked at was the remnant of cells and the cell walls only. So they were dead cells and wasn't living at all. And this gentleman here, Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, is the one who actually observed living cells. Now, he wasn't really a scientist to begin with. He was a Dutch businessman, and he owns a fabric shop that sells cloth for making clothing. He often uses his magnifying glass to examine his cloth. And then later on, he kind of moved into the industry of lens crafting. And then afterwards, he started making microscopes as well. Now, using his microscope, which is a higher quality one, he was able to observe living cells. And out of the living cells that he observed, sperms and also protists are the more famous ones. And because when Anthony was observing them, these cells kind of perform life functions or behave like animals. So Anthony wrote in his notes that these kind of cells, he's calling them animalcules. Now, at that time, Anthony also didn't really have a clear idea of what cells are, but he saw that they were behaving like animals and therefore called them animalcules, little animals. Now, unlike Robert Hooke, Anthony didn't publish any books because he wasn't really a scientist, he was more of a businessman. But whenever he made observations through the microscope, he would draw them, and then he would also jot notes down, and then later on he would send it to the Royal Society. Now the Royal Society is the Royal Society is kind of like an association which a lot of scholars would send letter to or publish their work through the Royal Society. And Anthony, although he wasn't really looking for his work to be published, he still wanted to send his knowledge and observation through. So within his lifetime, he wrote over 500 letters to the Royal Society, and a lot of them was about his observation through the microscope about living cells. Now, these are the first observations that we have of cells. But the cell theory, or the idea or concept of what cells are, wasn't really developed until the 1800s. And the cell theories that I have introduced you to, which is number one, all living things are made up of cells. Number two, cells are the smallest unit of life. And number three, cells come from pre-existing cells. So this set of cell theory is not put forward until the 1800s. And these are the scientists that had made major contribution towards building the cell theory. Now let's look at these two gentlemen first. Schwann and Schleiden, they are very good friends. Schwann is a German physician as well as a physiologist. So he looks at the interactions between the different components in a living organism, in a living animal. Whereas Matthias Schleiden, he is a German botanist, so he specializes in plants. Now, there was this time that Schleiden just brought it up to Schwann, saying that he was observing plants and he saw the little compartment chambers in plants, which was cells. And so he said to Schwann, saying he thinks that plants are made up of cells. Every single plant is made up of cells. And upon hearing that, Schwann think about the animal tissues that he had observed. And he also thinks that animal tissues are made up of smaller structures, and they are also called cells. So together they came up with the idea that all living things, whether they are plants or animals, they are made up of cells, and that cells are the smallest unit of life. And they published their idea and their findings with the Royal Society. Now, the third idea of the cell theory, right here, was published by Rudolf Virchow. So Rudolf Virchow is a German scientist as well, and he didn't actually came up with the idea, although he published it. He stole his idea from this Polish scientist called Robert Remak. Now, Robert Remak has a opposite political stance to what the Royal Society has, and therefore, the Royal Society did not publish Robert Remak's work. Now, because of the influence that Royal Society has in the industry of science, Robert Remak, although he made these amazing observations of how cells go through cell division and produce new cells, he was not recognized for this, and his work was not well known because it wasn't published. Rudolf Virchow, he knew of Remak's work. He looked at his findings, and then he go off and observe embryo cells, just like how Robert Remak did. And he saw that these embryotic cells, they would go through cell division, and then they would produce new cells. And he later on observed the cell division behavior in other types of cells other than embryotic cells as well. And so he grabbed Robert's idea, and then he published it through the Royal Society and was recognized for this idea. Now, it wasn't until later days that we found out Rudolf Virchow wasn't the first person who came up with this idea, but rather he stole it from Robert Remak. Now, I know that some of you have a question about if all the cells are coming from pre-existing cells, then where does the first cell come from? This is an extremely well-researched topic, but we don't have an answer for it yet. There are many proposed theories or hypotheses about where does the first cell come from. However, we don't have time to cover that in this biology course, so I'll leave it up to you. If you're interested, you may go and do some research on your own. And that's it for the cell theory and the first observations of cells.